Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, as we continue our classical conversation, we turn to Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War and examine the geopolitical nature of the Melian Dialogue. In continuing the theme of geopolitics, which we covered in our first introductory episode on Thucydides, we now segue into the famous Melian Dialogue and examine it from a geopolitical lens. Along with Pericles' funeral oration, the Melian Dialogue is the most famous of dialogues or orations in Thucydides' masterpiece. Most people who have never read the entirety of Thucydides have probably read or are at least familiar with this particular dialogue. It is also a classical case study in international realism in political science. Geopolitics is intimately tied to the discourse on the law of nature that the Athenians and the Melians engage in over the course of their dialogue. The Melians, in refusing the Athenian alliance, explain that they are following the law of nature, which is self-interest. The Athenians retort that while self-interest is tied up with the law of nature, the Melians have only grasped at the periphery of the law of nature. They don't fully understand it. The law of nature is self-preservation, and self-preservation is bound up with power. When the Melians fall back on the backing of the gods for their protection, the Athenians mock them and remark that the gods favor the strong, not the weak. And it is precisely the law of strength that is the law of nature, which compels the Athenians into action. Athens is direct with Milos in declaring their intentions. If the Athenians let Melian neutrality to remain, they will look weak in the eyes of their allies and their enemies. This they cannot abide by. The Athenians, then, are acting in perfect union with the law of nature by demanding Milos open their port to the Athenians and join them in their maritime alliance. This is what the law of nature demands. Unconvinced, the Melians rebuff the Athenians and remain convinced that the gods will protect them and that the Spartans will come to their aid. The Melians even appeal to the whole world is watching motif. And this is a principle which affects you as much as anybody, since your own fall would be visited by the most terrible vengeance, and would be an example to the world, the Melian representatives state. The Melians believe that if Athens assaults them, the Athenians will be exposed as naked brutes to the rest of the world. But the logic of the Melians is contorted and confused. The Athenians have acknowledged the law of nature is based on power, which manifests itself in the bid for self-preservation. The attack on Milos would not expose anything. It would, on the contrary, show the Athenians to be great, that they are acting in accord with the law of nature. The Athenians would, in their destruction of Milos, embody the very law of the world to the nth degree that everyone would learn from and emulate. Relating now back to the issue of geography and geopolitics, the Melians, we must remember, are an island polity. They are a maritime civilization, the same as Athens. The illogic of the Melians becomes more visible from this geopolitical lens. The Melians are aware that the law of nature entails self-interest. Self-interest is the contingent outgrowth of self-preservation. The Melians, however, are unable to make the connection between their self-interest to self-preservation as meaning that they should be aligned with Athens even though everything pushes them in this direction. Athens is the great sea power of Greece. Milos is a sea power. The Athenians possess the strongest navy in the Mediterranean. The Spartans would need to break the Athenian navy in order to help the Melians, something that is not only unpractical, but essentially impossible. Self-interest dictates that the Melians should embody their nature as a maritime polity and align with Athens. All over the dialogue, the Athenians continue to give the Melians this opportunity to recognize that they are a maritime polity, and therefore their actual self-interest to self-preservation should be to ally with the Athenians, the real axis of their law of nature. The Athenians, knowing this, came to Milos with an offer of submission rather than destruction. This is often forgotten because we know what the Athenians did to the Melians. However, the Athenians did not initially come as conquerors. They were pushed into that situation by Melian stubbornness. If Milos had accepted the Athenian offer, Milos would have been spared the destruction that followed, though admittedly added under Athenian hegemony. This returns us to the lesson the Corcyraeans awoke to when they petitioned Athens for her help in overthrowing their Corinthian overlords. As a seafaring maritime polity, Corcyra admitted their policy of isolation was wrong-headed. Isolation is a perfectly acceptable policy to hold as a land power, but it is untenable as a sea power. Again, because of the reality of the geopolitical nature of being a sea power, one is automatically internationalist in nature. You must have access to foreign ports. Foreign ports also need access to your ports. A great economy of trade and international arrangements consummates because of this. Sea power is predicated on openness, trade, and expansion. Isolation is the opposite of all three features of maritime nature. The Melian policy of isolation does not fit with their nature as a maritime polity. Milos then had to be destroyed because it was a maritime power aligned with the continental alliance of Sparta. The Athenians were forced into action by the law of geopolitical determinacy. The Melians had every opportunity to recognize that their geopolitical constitution pushed them to be an ally of Athens. It was Melian stubbornness that caused their destruction. Thucydides' Melian Dialogue is more than a mere case study in international relations and realism. It is a warning against being foolish with regards to one's geopolitical nature. All throughout the dialogue, inserted both subtly and explicitly, the realities of geopolitics is at the forefront of the dialogue. The Athenians regularly and routinely give the Melians every opportunity to recognize the law of nature, of self-interest, self-preservation, and geopolitics. The Melians, for various reasons, refused to accept their geopolitical nature and were therefore destroyed by the superior power acting in accord with its geopolitical nature. The next time you read the Melian Dialogue, one ought to use it as a case study in geopolitics.